Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next panel for a discussion on technology, the digital economy, and how it's changing global business. Our moderator, Dean Garfield, President and CEO, Information Technology Industry Council. He's joined by speakers Kathy Novelli, Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy and the Environment, and Senior Coordinator for International Information, Technology Diplomacy, U.S. Department of State, Vinton Cerf, Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist, Google, Jonathan Wetzel, Director of the McKinsey Global Institute, McKinsey & Company, Shanghai.
Should I wait for the clock?
Yeah.
Good morning. Yes. It is impossible for us to see anything in the audience, and so I'll just assume there are people there, and I'll get started because the clock is rolling. I noticed that there was an introduction done already, so I'll just jump right into the conversation, particularly since our time is short. And I'll start with Undersecretary Novelli. We know that the internet and broadband is a global good, and yet 60% of the world's population don't have access to it. It'd be good to start by talking about your thoughts on what we can do about that and what the State Department in particular is doing.
Well, thanks, Dean. It is a privilege to be here with with you and Vint and everybody. So. Exactly, it's a global good. And what's really striking to me, if you think about what we want to do in terms of development, and you think about what the World Bank has determined after looking at the economic analysis, and what they've determined is that for every 10% increase in connectivity in a developing country, there is a 1% to 2% rise in GDP. And if you think about the opportunities that presents for everybody, from education to healthcare to access to markets to access to other scientists, it's really remarkable. And so that's why we have actually started an initiative called Global Connect. And the idea behind it is that we want to catalyze getting more people online. And we have a goal of getting 1.5 billion people online by 2020. And we understand that it's not just the US government, it is actually a multi-stakeholder approach here that we need to bring together governments, not just communication ministers, but finance ministers as well, who have the funding. We need to bring together multilateral development banks, who also fund infrastructure, and in the past haven't really looked at the internet as fundamental infrastructure. And we need to bring together the private sector, who is doing all the innovation in this area and looking at various ways to connect those that are difficult to connect. And we, of course, also need the NGO community. So this is literally an all of the above approach. And we're aiming to be a catalyst. We're hosting a big event on this next week, which I know you'll be there.
I will be there.
And with Jim Kim, Secretary Kerry and Jim Kim are co-hosting it, to really try to move all this forward. We launched this whole concept in the fall at the UN General Assembly, but what we're looking at is how do we create opportunity for those who are going to be connected. How do we create opportunity for our businesses to be involved in all of this, in the economic activity of this? And how do we make sure that as these connectivity increases, that we are doing it with a sound policy basis so that we have a healthy internet on a going forward basis?
So I have two questions, one about the healthy internet and principles for guiding us going forward for Vint. But let me first start, Jonathan, by asking you, given your role at McKinsey and the fact that you're based in Shanghai. Kathy, Ambassador Novelli, Undersecretary Novelli, talked a little bit about opportunity. What are you seeing as far as opportunity for economic growth as a result of what you're seeing on the development of the internet?
Well, thank you. And it's a really interesting time. Frankly, after the recession, we sort of felt like that the global trade, finance, services took a bit of a hit. And so we've seen stabilization off of a peak in 2007 down in terms of the physical flows of maybe 10 or 15% off of where we were at the peak before that. And then on the other hand, we've seen a 45 times increase in the rate of cross-border bandwidth and data flow since 2005. So what's going on, we think, is a change in the character of what we mean by globalization. So globalization isn't anymore about just purely physical goods and services. It's digital globalization. It's people using the power of technology to create impacts, to create revenues, to create profits globally. And whether this, you see this in all sorts of ways. So obviously you see it in the countries and the regions that are more turned on, if you will, more switched on. So the most connected place in the world is Singapore, if you think in terms of total flows. And that is essentially their strategy, to be connected. And they are connected physically, they're connected through people, they're connected through finance, they're connected through technology. And this creates tremendous opportunity for them. But it's not only you don't have to be a hub to do that. In fact, probably the biggest single economic development impact is on the individual and the rise of the so-called the micro multinational. So, for example, if you go and you Google 20 kilowatt motors in Bangkok, and you just put that out there, what will you find? Well, you'll find one sponsored result from Siemens, which takes up the top half of the advertising bracket. And then you will find 15 pages of no-name individual motor manufacturers selling into the Thai market through Alibaba or JD.com or some other platform, which has created this tremendous globalization for people who literally don't speak the language. I mean, so it's pole vaulted language, it's pole vaulted finance, it's pole vaulted regulation and tariffs to create global companies like that. So that's the impact of the technology, and that's what we mean by digital globalization.
Thanks, Jonathan. Vint, you were there at the start. It seems like you want to build on that, so just go ahead.
Yeah, I would just love this. I mean, what both of you have said. First thing, everyone in this room knows that the flow of money lubricates business. What you also should have just learned, if you didn't know it already, is that the flow of information lubricates business, and internet is one of the means by which information flow can be facilitated. So the first question is what to do about getting more internet infrastructure in place. As Google's chief internet evangelist, that's my primary objective. I want everybody online, and I'd like it to be at highest speeds possible, lowest delays, and everything else. One thing I think is important for everyone in this room to recognize is that this big tent called internet supports multiple business models. There are some parts of internet that are run as not-for-profits, some are partly run by governments, some is private sector, some of it's in your own backyard or in your living room or down in the basement. So multiple business models are possible here, not just the standard for-profit kind of thing. The second question, though, is what are the conditions for successful infrastructure development and evolution? And there are a number of them that are not technical in nature. One of them is having well-educated workforce that knows how to build and operate this stuff and how to use it. The second one has to do with financing, which is what you care about, and that's making sure that there is capital available for people to build the infrastructure and the flow of funding in order to operate. A third thing is, surprisingly enough, electrical power. The internet doesn't work without it. And if you go to places where electrical power is not widely available, you can see that internet has some troubles. Although people are out there with their bicycles recharging batteries and running inverters and making internet equipment run in spite of all of that. And finally, just access to the technology itself, having access to facilities to build these things. In the end, what will be important, and we'll build on Kathy's point about GDP growth, is open access to the internet so that you can build, without having to get permission from everybody under the sun, build a new product, build a new service. People should have the freedom to invent. They also should have the freedom to fail, and this is one of the problems we see in some cultures where failure leaves you with a mark on your forehead and no one will ever give you any money anymore to do anything. In Silicon Valley, failure is a mark of experience. For the unless you fail all the time, that's a different problem. But for the most part, we treat failure and experience as an important asset. And finally, in terms of reinforcing what you were saying about the businesses, small companies through the internet get access to global markets potentially if they're interested in trying to satisfy them. And so here we have this wonderful infrastructure that's capable of making the world a a place to do business in. No local economy can equal the global economy. If you can attack the global economy in addition to your domestic economy, you have a much bigger opportunity for success. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry to go on.
No. Kathy, building on that, you worked on this at these issues at USTR and then at Apple Inc. and now the State Department. What gives you cause for concern, and where do you see opportunity, change that makes you feel good about where we're heading?
Well, one of the things that I was thinking, building on what Vince said, is everywhere I travel, which is extensive, I always go to incubators. And because I just want to meet, who's inventing things around the world. And one of the things that is absolutely key is that folks are inventing things for their own markets. So yes, they have access to global markets, but each market has its own unique characteristics, its own needs. And so the internet has really kind of been a catalyst to have more people think creatively about how they can fulfill those market needs. It gives them another tool. And they can globalize that as well, but it just is fascinating to me to see how people start. For example, if you think about Kenya, where they had a problem with banking and people not having access to banking, so they invented kind of mobile banking and the concept of it and drove it forward, and now everybody uses that. And so it's, we all get to learn from these innovations that arise in different places. So I think there's an incredible opportunity there for local folks. So there's also an incredible opportunity for our own companies to hook onto that, to invest in that, to have access to more markets themselves with what they have to offer, to partner. So I think there's incredible opportunities. I think the concerns that I see really come mostly from governments who haven't been prioritizing this. And even, talking to some of the multilateral development banks, it's not that they're opposed to the internet, but part of the reason why we started Global Connect is because it was very clear to me that in their own mind, they didn't think about the internet as basic infrastructure. So they were busy allocating funds for how they were going to create this basic infrastructure in countries. And to my mind, we are in the 21st century, and this is the road of the 21st century. And if you don't start putting this into your infrastructure, you're going to keep falling farther and farther and farther behind. And that is a serious concern that I have about this. Going beyond that, there are some countries who are also concerned about what is said over the internet. And that's obviously something we have to deal with. The question of censorship has been an age-old question, so it's not new, it's just on a bigger scale.
Different medium.
Yeah. But I think if you go back to the economic side, there's also questions about how, when I said we want to have an internet that's healthy, one of the important things is that you have to have competition. And competition drives excellence. And so, a lot of folks, they start up something in a country and they're like, okay, this is only going to be one supplier, it's only going to be, it's all going to be, we're going to keep it all close. And that is going to choke off, I think, progress. And so we're trying to get folks to understand that competition is your friend and not your enemy as well.
Good point.
Jonathan, a part of your job is giving advice to governments and businesses. Give some advice to the folks in this room, particularly advice that you find that people often ignore that they shouldn't.
Oh, that's fun. I usually don't get to be the voice of doom because I think it's true there's lots of opportunity, but most of that's, first of all, going to be captured by the consumer, and then secondly by attackers, so the new entrants, new business models. The average lifespan of a company is declining dramatically. I think you all know this, but you should prepare for more. And there are many value chains, many supply chains which are intensely local, which will get dislocated very quickly. Construction comes to mind. And sort of how one thinks about where the next generation of engineering and construction revenues are coming from. Globally, emerging markets are over 50% of trade, and they're growing. South-South trade is the fastest growing portion of that. So if you don't sort of have the capability to engage in the global market, either you go to the global market or the global market comes to you. It's a lot better to have the capabilities to do that. So, while the world isn't flat, really, I mean, there are places which are more connected and and places that are less, and I think that's a big challenge for society. Corporations should be a lot more flat. And that's the sort of accelerating your response time, your capacity to get information, turn that into a product, iterate quickly. I was in a meeting yesterday, and I was sort of it was nice, it was optimistic that people had used the word 50 years old and said, and still young in the same sentence. That made me feel very good. It made me worried for the company too. The capacity to just, not only have young people in your organization, but to actually listen to them and to give them roles and responsibilities that are commensurate with their capabilities, that's going to differentiate a lot of the winners. And for governments, as was said, I mean, there's a tremendous capacity challenge just to put that in place. There's also a human capital challenge, and there's a dislocation challenge. I was in Australia. I cannot tell you how many conversations I had about taxi drivers and medallions. I mean, and who would think that a piece of software from Silicon Valley would upend the pension plans of Australia? And if you think that is something, you wait till autonomous vehicles sort of takes a lot of people out of the driving profession in North America. I think so. Dislocation is just getting started, and this has a real social government implication.
Could I add one thing to that?
Of course.
It's very interesting. I totally agree with you. But I found a sign of hope in Chicago, of all places. I was there at their incubator, 1871. And they have, because there's so much manufacturing there, they have focused on trying to bring the manufacturers together with what they call coding ninjas and other sort of technology folks, and sort of saying, okay, you're doing this, but it's going to change. So how do you take the best minds of the connected world and apply it to your situation? And it is fascinating to see that there are some companies who recognize that they have to evolve or else they're going to become dinosaurs. So hopefully, there is a way forward for that.
Vint, you were in the green room. We were talking about the fact you were just in Cuba and you were sharing some of the entrepreneurial creativity you saw there. I think it would be interesting for the audience to hear some of that.
I would love to respond to that. May I say a little bit, though, about what keeps me awake at night, which is relative to what
My job is just to get you to talk, so talk about whatever you want.
Thank you for that. Yeah, pragmatic. Yeah. So two things. First of all, keep in mind that every one of you has a mobile phone or two. Probably most of them are smartphones. Guess what? Those were invented at Apple less than 10 years ago. So what you have right now is this massive raft of increasing amount of connectivity thanks to the investment in mobile phone technology. The next wave is coming. It's called the Internet of Things. And that will outweigh the mobile phones in terms of numbers by factors of 10 to 100. You should be worried about this. I know I am. The headline I'm worried about is 100,000 refrigerators attack Bank of America. and you laugh, but in fact, the computers that are running those refrigerators are powerful enough that if they get loaded up with malware, they can do a lot of damage. So we should be worried about that. And so the triumvirate of things that keep me awake are security, safety, and privacy in the space of Internet and Internet of Things.
Can I relate it to that, actually? Yeah. You were there for the founding of the Internet.
This is going to be the what were you thinking question.
Yeah, exactly. But not only what were you thinking, what do we do about it to take advantage of the benefits, but to limit some of the challenges that we know now about?
The fact is that the technology that helps secure the Internet was not available when we were doing the design in 1973. The public key crypto wasn't even suggested until 1976. And the RSA algorithms didn't emerge until 78 or 79. They weren't available when I was freezing the design so I could get something built to see if it would work. But we have capabilities today that can be retrofitted and are being retrofitted into the system. At Google, for example, everything we run is HTTPS, the secure encrypted version of the Hypertext Transport Protocol, which is what runs the World Wide Web. We're doing strong two-factor authentication for our people and for anyone else that wants it, again, to protect you from crappy username and password combinations. So there are a bunch of things that we can do, are doing, and still need to do in order to make this a more secure and safe system. The scary part about the Internet of Things is those devices may have software in them that has bugs. We don't know how to write software that doesn't have bugs. So first, we have to be prepared to update the software in a secure way. And second, we have to be prepared for the consequence that a bug causes a problem. And with the Internet of Things and control of physical activity, the heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and security, we really have headaches on our hands. So I'm not trying to scare you away from all this. I'm just trying to tell you that the technical community knows this and is really working hard on it.
I assume that's not the buzzer for us, but
Well, you never know. It's some...
Speaking of the Internet of Things, I don't want to get us too deep into a conversation about encryption. I would like that, but we don't have enough time for it. I'm curious, Jonathan, and then I'm going to come to you, Kathy, how companies are thinking about the Internet of Things and whether they're adequately preparing and what they should be doing, both companies and governments. And I'm curious, Kathy, your perspective of that, of how governments, what you're doing and what else we should be thinking about.
I totally agree, of course, with what Vince says. I mean, this is going to be a much bigger wave of innovation. And it's just as we build things and then we discover they're actually more useful for everything else. So we built this wireless infrastructure for voice, and then all of a sudden now it's data. And so we're going to, this revolution is now connecting everything. It's not just the company, of course. I mean, we see the use cases evolving fastest in places where you have, first of all, obviously physical capacity, but you also have to have application and human capital. As importantly, you have to have regulations which allow for experimentation. If you're talking about a smart city, you can't, if people are not willing to share public data and not in a secure way, you're not going to have any use cases. And then this dislocation question, because you're actually asking people not just to have data, but to change something. They have to change how they dispatch the police cars or how the building inspector does the job. And so these things are actually union, in some cases, issues. So there's a whole conversation about how do we rethink what we mean by work. We think that up to 40% of daily jobs could be automated. Not every job, but 40%, not every job, 100% of a job will be automated, but 40% of every job. Every job will actually be automated. So this is going to affect companies at the at a very individual level to change all the processes as a result. I think it's IoT. We're going to see again a tremendous wave of dislocation in companies. I think that most of the value will go to the consumer. Biggest in a consumer economy, the things that make the difference are value of time, value of life. So anything that saves people from getting killed. Notably traffic fatalities, or protects them from environmental hazards, water, air. These will be the first things up to go. And then who's going to make the money? Well, usually again it's the attacker. It's the person who comes in who says, I can be curious, I can do things in a different way, and I don't feel constrained a lot by my quote legacy assets. On the other hand, I certainly share the optimism that there is no de facto rule which says that an incumbent can't change their stripes. I mean, that there are many good examples there too. But we will see dislocation, and we will have a tremendous need, therefore, to reinvest in our people and our human capital. I just want to come back to that. We have this educational model which says that 80% of our educational expenditures are between the ages of 18 and 25. It's like, why? I mean, why would that be the case? I mean, when we know the human brain can learn as much between the ages of 40 and 60 as between the ages of 20 and 40. Have we decided not to learn anymore? I think every company should have that as their number one priority, is to figure out how to fix the talent model, because that's all you got. There's nothing else.
Kathy, do you have a sense of whether, or your thoughts on how well governments are preparing for this eventuality?
I think there's two things I would say. Okay. One, I totally agree that we need to think about how we have a flexible workforce, and an educated, flexible workforce who, when some things are no longer relevant and new things come in, we can adapt to that. And so we don't all just have chaos and people saying, oh, I'm out of a job and there's nothing else I can do. And I think that governments have to be thinking about that. When I was in Detroit just last week, the mayor of Detroit just announced that every high school student who could get into a community college would be able to go for free. Wow. Which I thought was, exactly the kind of thinking that we need to be doing in a flexible way. The other thing, though, is, there's a tendency, I think, of governments to feel that they have to fix everything. And I think it's hard.
Not in this administration, of course.
I was thinking about overseas. it's
That's
really,
sarcasm if you missed it, but go ahead.
it's hard to sometimes leave your hands off things and see how things develop. And especially for innovation and for technology, you have to tolerate a certain amount of chaos in order to get progress.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that the government never needs to intervene. Of course it does. But you kind of got to let things play out a little bit so you can figure out how you intervene without completely choking off the innovation. And finding that line is a fine line. And that is something that we see around the world. Even in the case of taxi cab drivers, it's sort of, somebody invented a much more consumer-friendly way to do things, and so how does that all play itself out? But I think that is going to be the biggest challenge that governments face, is how do you protect the health and safety and welfare of your people, but not have them be stuck in cement and stasis.
So this is, the internet story is a good example of that. The government started the project. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency had full control over that. I ran the program for 6 years and, wrote the checks and made a lot of the decisions. But in the end, the government kept stepping further and further and further away from control. NSF was a wonderful example of that until finally, the latest thing is that the DOC and NTIA said that they want to sever their oversight of ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. I think the U.S. government did a spectacular job over a period of 4 decades of nurturing this thing and not messing around with it very much. Congress was cooperative in that regard. We're going to run out of time in a minute.
Yeah, we've got 1 minute and 35 seconds. So each of you take 30 seconds and answer the question that I wasn't smart enough to ask. We'll just go down the line.
If you want to go away with one word that I would urge you to think about, it's incentives. If you want a different outcome, understand what the incentives are that are driving that which you don't like and find a way to change those incentives. Otherwise, forget it.
Wow, 20 seconds. Well done.
I would say things have to be economically sustainable in development, in conservation and everything. We have to look at what's the economic model that's going to sustain the internet and all of the things that flow from it. It's not just about charity.
Great.
$8 trillion. That's the value of data flows to the global economy. Go get it.
On that note, thank you very much. Thank you for being a great audience.
Good. That was great. You did a great job.